Hello and welcome back to Mossy Bottom. Just over a year ago now, it seems hard to believe, I recorded my very first YouTube video, beginning right here on the edge of the forest. And a few of you suggested that I should make an update video, walking the same route, kind of showing you how things have changed and what the garden and vegetable areas look like a year on. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. Let's get started, shall we? So here we are in the newly created duck area, and you'll notice we have a new reinforced bridge which I built recently in response to the ducks' mysterious ability to expand the spring. Since they've inhabited the water here, the water level has actually risen by about 20 centimetres. So the old bridge that used to be here involved a kind of leap of faith which frequently ended in wet socks and the occasional swear word. So it got replaced by this lovely new one, which you can just see there. I think the ducks have actually grown a bit since their starring roles back in May. They've certainly grown in confidence as they now wander here, there and everywhere on my little plot in search of slugs. Never, of course, leaving each other's side. They're a real trio. Interestingly, I think that Nugget seems to be the leader. She's certainly the boldest. That's Nugget there. Quack, quack. So this area behind me last year was mostly brassicas. Kohlrabi, Swedes, purple sprouting broccoli and carrots as well, which I purposefully left over the winter and spring to go to flower, because brassica flowers in particular make wonderful chicken feed, particularly in the spring when you've got that sort of hungry gap and your salad plants aren't established enough yet. So because I heavily picked the brassica flowers back in the spring, what's left now in early July is a mixture of grasses, buttercup, the odd nettle, thistle, a bit of willow herb, which is the purple flowering plant you can see in the background, and of course these beautiful things. And these are actually, for anyone who hasn't guessed it yet, carrots. This is what carrots look like if you leave them to go to flower. So these are a few extra roots that I left in the ground last year. They might have had a few slug bites, so I chose to leave them. And they've produced this absolutely beautiful display of flowers now in midsummer. And I'm hoping later in the year to collect the seeds and use them the following spring. So in the top area of this pizza slice shaped vegetable plot, I grew potatoes last year. But this year, after a volunteer spent weeks digging in a few mountains of compost, it's mostly been turned to summer crops. So this is the last of my early turnips. I've already harvested about 10 from this little patch, some of which have gone on my stall at the end of the lane. And then we have kohlrabi, purple kohlrabi, which is one of my absolute favourites. For anyone who hasn't tried it, it's perfect in cold salads. It has a kind of apple-like texture. It's very crisp and juicy. And then moving on, you can see the kohlrabi in there just beginning to develop there. We have some cauliflower, and this is my first year trying to grow cauliflower, but it seems to be doing very well. You can see the heads are forming at various stages of development. Then we have some spinach. I had a bit of space left over for some spinach, so I put that in there. And at the end of the row, we start the peas. The peas did really well on my stall last year, and I absolutely love them myself, particularly fresh. So I've grown a mass of peas this year. And if I zoom along the next row there, you'll see just how many I've got. So there are actually 3 different varieties of pea this year that I'm growing. The white flowered ones here are called Caribe, which is a type of sugar snap pea, does really well here. The cream flowered variety in the background is Waverex, which is a garden pea, my first time growing them. And the purple and blue flowered variety in the background is an Irish heritage variety called Daniel O'Rourke. And although I've yet to taste the peas, I'm very impressed by the growth rate of the plants for a heritage variety. They were actually sent to me, like quite a few of my different crops this year, by a very generous chap in Dublin called Graham, who I believe aspires to make a similar move to mine one day. And frankly, with peas as good as this, I think he's bound to succeed. So here are some beetroot on the next row at varying stages of development. There's a nice big fat one in there somewhere. He's nearly ready to be harvested. And behind them you can see sunflowers. And if I find one here, I think I can demonstrate that they're almost ready to open up. You can see the flowers are just forming in there, so they'll open up fairly soon. And I've actually tried to grow sunflowers for the last 2 years. And unfortunately, they tend to flower a bit too late in kind of late August, which means they just don't mature in time to produce seeds. So this year I had a cunning plan, and this variety is actually a dwarfing variety of giant sunflower. So they kind of look like you've chopped the head off a full-size sunflower and stuck it in the ground, but they're supposed to look like that. And the advantage, of course, is that they mature an awful lot quicker. So I'm kind of optimistic that I might actually get a harvest of seeds this year, if all goes to plan. And then we have my sweet corn growing area, which is just behind me. And I've grown sweet corn every year now since moving here, so this will be my 3rd year of growing it. One of the things that you read a lot about with sweet corn is companion planting. Because it grows upright, you have a lot of space around the base, so gardeners will encourage you to plant lettuce or squash or some other leafy plant to fill that space. And that sounds great, and I thought it was a fantastic idea when I first read about it, but the trouble is, in the west of Ireland, what it tends to do is kind of encourage mould growth and fungus around the stalks of the sweet corn plants. So for me at least, it hasn't worked really well. So hence this year my sweet corn plants are getting an entire bed to themselves in the hope that they do that little bit better. And further along from the corn on this top row, we have the youngest of my outdoor tomato plants. You can just see them there between the lettuce, and I'll harvest the lettuce within the next few weeks to give the tomatoes complete space. These are sun gold tomatoes, which is a type of cherry tomato, very sweet, and I have some black Russians in a different location too. And it's an absolute myth that you can't grow tomatoes outdoors in the west of Ireland. They will flower and fruit, you'll just get a much smaller crop than you would in a greenhouse or polytunnel. But one thing you have to do is keep propping them up with stakes as they get bigger, because they're very sort of floppy plants and they tend to fall over. But you can see in there we've got flowers forming, and a few of them have got little tomatoes on them already. Now I know if this was in a greenhouse it would be 3 times the size, but you know, I'll still probably get 20 or 30 tomatoes off that, so it's well worth growing, I think. So as we emerge through the elder, raspberry and nettle tunnel, the first thing you'll probably notice is the chicken area, which is located this year on what was my summer crop last year. So all the goodness from 7 chickens pooping away has gone back into that soil, ready for next spring when it will be grown on again. You can see I have some new varieties in there this year. There is 3 cream leg bar chicks, which are about 3 months old now, I think, so they're beginning to mature slowly, having a good life. That's Elvis, looking far more innocent than he really is. the master of escaping, and crowing loudly at inopportune moments. And I believe I referred to this area last year as my strawberry growing empire, which actually it certainly has been this year. One of my friends is staying with me at the moment, and we've been harvesting a huge box of strawberries every day, probably about 3 or 4 kilograms every day for the last 3 weeks now. I'm actually selling them up on the stall. I've got so many. In fact, some of them are even going in my compost, which is a real travesty. But the chickens can only eat so many strawberries before they get diarrhea, so they have to go somewhere. One of the reasons that they're doing so well is that they're built on hugel mounds. So under each of these rows, I buried piles of rotting wood. A simple permaculture idea. So as the wood breaks down, it releases heat, warming the soil and releasing nutrients at the same time. And of course the stone paths also absorb heat during the day and increase the overall temperature at night. So it just helps encourage them to fruit, a bit more heat, a bit better environment. And I put a load of wood chip on there as well in the winter, so that's probably helped a bit too. So behind the chicken area we have my main growing area this year. So directly behind me here we have lots of roots, carrots in this case, lots of lovely Autumn King and Eskimo varieties which are very hardy and reliable. They produce really big carrots. And there's another variety which Graham sent me, the Giant Red, which is apparently an Italian variety of carrots. So I'm a bit dubious about how well it'll do. We'll see how it copes with the relatively cool Irish soil and climate. It's growing well at the moment though. And then over here we have some parsnips, and these are the good old Tender and True variety. You'll notice with a lot of the crops here, like the parsnips and the peas as well, they're kind of at different stages of maturity. And that's just because I plant seeds every couple of weeks from the beginning of the sowing phase until the end, which means that you avoid that kind of harvest glut where you get a huge crop of everything all at once, which you can't possibly eat in time before it starts to rot. So the parsnips behind me here are all staggered. Then we have some more kohlrabi on the next row, and you can still see the odd one with a plastic greenhouse on it. Ones that just haven't grown that well, or perhaps they've got nobbled by a few slugs. And if I move around to the next row, here we've got some summer cabbage, which Elvis escaped a few times, I'm afraid, and did some damage. He pecked them down, so they're not looking quite as good as they should, but they're still growing away nicely. It's interesting, isn't it, how these two plants went in at the same time. But this little guy has really struggled, and only now is he beginning to do well, whereas his neighbour here is absolutely huge. You'll see as well we've got some more tomato plants between them. The summer cabbage will be harvested soon, and that will just leave the tomato plants in this space, so they'll have lots of vacant soil to spread out into. And then at the back here we have the kale. This variety here is called Uncle John's, which is very hardy and heavy cropping. Most of it, in fact, ends up being chicken feed, which they absolutely love. Next to the Uncle John's kale, we have some curly kale plants. I think this variety is called the Blue Curled. And frankly, this is the type that you would see if you bought kale in a supermarket. I personally think it's tastier. It may be a texture thing, I'm not too sure, but it does seem a bit more flavoursome when you cook it up. I did only grow 2 plants this year though, because as you can see, it's much slower growing. It's not nearly as well developed. So I tend to reserve these 2 little guys for human consumption, and I'm afraid the chickens have to make do with the common stuff. I don't think they mind though. Oh, maybe they do. And these are some lettuce plants which have been left harvested heavily and then left to go to flower. I've never actually left lettuce plants this long, so I'm curious to see when these little flowers are going to open up and what it's going to look like. So in the final row we have some leeks. You can see in the middle there the long-leaved plants, and some more turnips, a bit more kale. And then we get to my overwinter section. So all the crops in this area here will stay over the winter. Firstly, we have some Brussels sprouts here, and they should be ready to harvest around November, December time. So they've got a long way to go yet, although the plants are doing fantastically well. Much better than they were this time last year. A few more spaces for a few things I'm yet to plant. And this second row we have some purple sprouting broccoli. So that will be harvested in the spring. Although interestingly, this guy and a few others has already produced little florets, so I'll fry those up and enjoy them in the summer. A bit more companion planting, some lettuce maturing in the gaps while the broccoli grows. So the lettuce will be harvested first and then taken out to make more space for the broccoli. And finally, in this row near the chickens, we've got 3 different varieties of cabbage. This first cabbage here is called Delaway, and again it was sent to me by Graham. It's an Irish heritage variety. I've realised basically, even though it's called cabbage, it's essentially kale with a cabbagey name. Then we have good old-fashioned Savoy cabbage, which I love. Really big, juicy leaves, does really well over the winter. And some red cabbage as well on the end. They're all doing marvellously well. I couldn't hope for more. In fact, I might even make some sauerkraut this year. I've got so much cabbage. And in this area behind me, which was the chicken area last year, we now have my potatoes, enjoying all that nitrogen-enriched soil. Last year I grew 4 varieties of potato. This year I've streamlined my operation. It's mostly Orla and Roosters, which seem to do best here in the Irish climate. In this section here, you'll also notice I have hay, which I've been cutting and intend to store for the first time this year over the winter. Most of it will be used either for chicken bedding, in the duck enclosure, or possibly to feed my latest 2 additions, which I'll show you now. So this is Wassail and Fossick, my 2 new rabbits, charged with lawn mowing between rows of potatoes, keeping the weeds and grass down to save me a bit of work. And incidentally, I'm going to make a video about how I created this rabbit tractor, so look out for that. In case you're wondering where Moss has been throughout this video, he has a new fixation, and that's the creatures living in this enclosure, which are quail. And they tend to hide in the undergrowth and remain perfectly still, which I think Moss sees as a challenge to his ability to detect them. So he lurks around the enclosure, trying to find where they are and then staring at them very fixedly. So moving to the caravan area, you can see a few extra strawberry plants there, some comfrey, which I'll be planting out soon, some cuttings from my various currant bushes, and then we have in this raised bed some marrows, which you can see are doing rather well. They're in flower at the moment, and marrows seem to be the hardiest variety of squash. So if you live in this kind of climate and would like to grow squash outside, then it's probably the best type to try. I think you can see, if I zoom in there, some little baby marrows growing. The flowers apparently are also delicious, so a bit of a tasty morsel there once they drop off. And I've plugged some of the gaps with radishes, which you can see are maturing nicely there. Radishes are fantastic for that. They're really fast growing, and you can sort of have them to fill spaces of soil between all manner of other vegetables. So there's some radishes in there. So in the second covered raised bed this year we have some pumpkins, and this is a variety called Jack Be Little, which is another dwarfing variety of vegetable. And anyone out there who Googles Jack Be Little pumpkins, I'm sure your first reaction will be how cute. But for me the big advantage is that they are quicker to ripen than ordinary pumpkins, which means that you can get away with a shorter growing season and it's more likely that I'll get ripe pumpkins. Saying all that, I've never tried to grow them before, so at this stage, fingers crossed they actually do well. We'll see. And not too much has changed around the caravan this year. You'll notice we have my rustic table, which I made a few months ago and is really nice for eating out in the warm evenings. Behind it we have some nasturtiums, some chamomile, some mint, and in this pot here, any of my friends from horticulture college that are watching might recognise what's growing. I hope yours are doing as well. And finally, as the sun sets over the hill, we have my newly created forest garden, which I planted here back in the winter, and I'm going to take you on a quick tour. So first of all, we have a conference pear tree, that most hardy of pear trees, which produces that most hard of pears. And it's the only tree that I've planted here in the winter which still has fruit on it. The others, many of them flowered and produced fruit, but they've since fallen off. And that's to be expected, seeing as they've only been here for 6 months. It's going to take a little while for them to get established. And as I'm walking around, you'll notice plenty of currant bushes. Here we've got a red currant with lots of currants growing away, ready to be harvested. And there's black currants and white currants as well. Over here we've got some autumn raspberries and some gooseberry bushes there in the background. Plenty of rhubarb as well, some peppermint, some chamomile over there. And then we have my cherry trees. We've got 2 sweet varieties, a Van and a Stella. And this one here is a Morello cooking cherries. A quick mention for this little fella, this is a honeyberry bush, and it did produce a few berries this year, the most delicious blue berries that are like overripe, extra fat blueberries. So very tasty. I'm looking forward to more harvests from that little guy. And this is a Doyen du Comice pear tree, which is a French variety, as you probably guessed. It produces very sweet, succulent, juicy pears. Whether or not it will yield a harvest here in the relatively cool Irish summer, I'm not too sure, but I had to give it a try because I remember them from my childhood and they are absolutely delicious. So some aronia bushes as well. This produces very astringent, quite sour berries, but high in antioxidants, fantastic in smoothies. Lots more currant bushes. And then we get to my apple trees. So the first one here is a Braeburn, which produces wonderful storing apples, great for storing over the winter. And then we have a Bramley. This one is that famous cucking apple, and I can't wait to make some apple pies and crumbles from its harvest. And finally, we have an Elstar, which produces sweet apples that you eat in the summer. So another aronia and a few more currant bushes. That's my forest garden. It may not seem that different, but I promise you a heck of a lot of work has gone into Mossy Bottom over the last 12 months. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of those who've come and volunteered here, though there weren't actually that many, but those of you who've helped in the last year, whether it be shifting stones or pulling up weeds or feeding animals. It's certainly true to say that my little dream wouldn't be possible without all that help, so a huge thank you. And that's just about it for this video. As always, thank you for watching and subscribing. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summer. It's been beautiful here this last few days. I'm absolutely loving it. And I'll see you again really soon. Bye-bye.